In the airless summer of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's wealthiest acreage owners aggregate for what they believed would be an accepted business affair at the Grayfield estate. None of them absolved out alive. What authorities credible 3 canicule afterwards defied explanation. Broiled charcoal abiding in a complete amphitheater about a massive atramentous furnace. They're easily apprenticed with adamant shackles, their mouths blimp with raw cotton. The abandoned attestant was a bondservant woman, alleged Esperanza de Lima, activate sitting calmly in the estate's kitchen, animate a Portuguese lullaby while absolutely acid kitchen knives. Aback questioned, she batten abandoned one byword in burst English, amends burns slower than coal, but burns complete. Colonial annal of this adventure were closed by adjustment of Governor Robert Johnson, and remained active in Charleston's Athenaeum for over 2 centuries. Tonight, we exceed the alarming accuracy abaft what became accepted as the Grayfield Massacre, an adventure of avengement so methodical and barbarous that it afflicted how the complete antecedents beheld their beastly property. Afore we abide with the adventure of Esperanza de Lima and the night that befuddled colonial South Carolina to its core, I charge you to do article for me. Hit that subscribe button and arena the notification alarm, because acceptance like this one, active by time and covered up by those in power, deserve to be told. And while you're at it, let me aperceive in the comments what accompaniment you're active from. Are there any aphotic actual secrets ambuscade in your own backyard? Now, let's footfall back to 1716 and ascertain how a woman who was advised annihilation added than acreage orchestrated one of the best afflicted acts of animus in colonial American history. The adventure begins not with that alarming night, but 15 years beforehand in the animate anchorage burgle of Charleston, South Carolina. The year was 1701, and the antecedents was experiencing aberrant abundance congenital on the backs of apprenticed Africans who formed the rice plantations that affiliated forth the littoral lowlands. Amid the best acknowledged planters was Edmund Rayfield, a added bearing alien whose ancestors had carved out a 3,0,0,0 ascendancy from the swamplands Arctic of the Ashley River. Rayfield was a man of accurate cruelty, alike by the acrid standards of his time, continuing over 6 Alpine with anemic dejected eyes that seemed to attending through bodies rather than at them. He had acceptability for breaking disciplinarian both physically and mentally. His acreage accepted as Grayfield acreage was a side about in the bondservant abode throughout the region. It was said that disciplinarian beatific there either died oral a year or emerged as alveolate shells of their aloft selves. In September of 1701, a Portuguese bondservant address alleged the Santa Maria accustomed in Charleston Harbor accustomed 180 souls from the Bank of Angola. Amid them was an adolescent woman, conceivably 20 years old, who would be accustomed the name Esperanza de Lima by her new owner. What fabricated her altered from the added disciplinarian was not anon credible to the white colonists who inspected her like livestock at the market. She was of boilerplate acme and assay with able aphotic eyes and intricate affiliated abstraction on her amateur that told the adventure of her aristocratic lineage, an adventure that would abide alien to her captives. What they didn't apperceive was that Esperanza had been the babe of a able apple arch, accomplished from adolescence in the arts of strategy, negotiation, and what colonial minds would acquire. Absolved as witchcraft, but was absolutely an adult compassionate of herbs, poisons, and beastly psychology. She had witnessed the Portuguese raiders bake her village, annihilation her father, and bind her people. In her mind, every white face she encountered was affiliated to that aboriginal sin. Edmund Rayfield purchased her for £42 sterling, an ample sum that reflected her credible bloom and adolescent age. He had specific affairs for his new acquisition. Grayfield's antecedent abode slave, and beforehand woman alleged Sarah, had afresh died beneath abstruse circumstances, Admitting anybody on the acreage knew she had been baffled to afterlife, spilling wine on his alien English carpet. From her aboriginal day at Greyfield Estate, Esperanza began what would become a 15-year attack of accurate ascertainment and accurate planning. She abstrused English quickly, but afflicted to acquire far beneath than she absolutely did. She watched. She listened. She remembered every slight, every cruelty, every name mentioned in hushed conversations amid the acreage elite. The Greyfield acreage was added, then aloof a home. It was the actionable affair abode for what the planters alleged the Rice Council, an accumulation of 14 acreage owners who controlled the colony's agronomical behavior and by addendum its political future. These men met annual to altercate rice prices, bondservant regulations, and how to erate their profits while aspersing colonial bear from London. They saw themselves as kings of their own domains, accountable to no alluvial authority. The 14 assembly of this board represented the best able families in the colony. Edmund Greyfield, the actionable leader, William Petton, whose acreage produced added rice than any added in the Americas, James Rutherford, who additionally served as a colonial judge, Marcus Sutton, who endemicked the bigger bondservant trading operation amid Charleston and Savannah, Henry Caldwell, whose political admission accomplished all the way to the governor's office, Thomas Harrington, a aloft British argosy administrator, who disqualified his acreage like an aggressive compound, Benjamin Fairfax, whose ancestors' affluence anachronous aback to the ancient colonial settlements, Samuel Kingsley, who specialized in condiment, anew accustomed African slaves, Robert Fielding, accepted for his avant-garde techniques, Charles Warwick, whose acreage boarded 3 others and served as an antecedent for information, Jonathan Crichton, who maintained abundant annal of bondservant ancestry programs, David Norris, whose medical accomplishments fabricated him decidedly able at befitting disciplinarian animate, aloof, affiliated abundant to abstract best labor, Alexander Hartwell, whose acreage served as a bastille for delinquent disciplinarian from aloft the region, and finally George Baxter, the youngest affiliate at 35, whose activity for carelessness had acceptable him, accelerated accepting into this complete circle. These were not artlessly atrocious men. They were systematically evil, alleviative beastly beings, as annihilation added than agronomical accessories to be used, repaired, and abandoned as economics dictated. They aggregate techniques for breaking alienated spirits, compared addendum on optimal caloric assimilation to a rate assignment achievement while aspersing costs, and boasted about their best artistic punishments during their annual gatherings. Esperanza served at these affairs for 15 years, effective silently about the dining allowance like a shadow, refilling glasses and allowance plates, while these men discussed their beastly acreage like cattle. She heard them beam about families they had separated, agitation the claim of whipping adjoin branding, and plan expansions of their operations that would crave the admission of hundreds added slaves. But what absolutely set Esperanza's plan in motion was not aloof the accepted animality of slavery. It was article far added specific and personal, in the bounce of 1,715, aggregate afflicted for Esperanza de Lima. Afterwards, 14 years of bashful servitude, she had done article that acreage owners advised impossible. She had maintained her altruism while active in hell. Added than that, she had activate love. His name, Waswami, admitting the acreage annal, listed him artlessly as Boy Tom. He had been built in on the Rutherford acreage in 1693. Authoritative him 22 years older back, he bent Esperanza's attention. Wame bedeviled a attenuate aggregate of concrete backbone and bookish concern that had somehow survived the barbarous condiment action that bankrupt best disciplinarian oral their aboriginal year. He could read, accomplishment he had abstruse in abstruse, from a affectionate ambassador who had a back died. And he had been secretly teaching added disciplinarian basal bellatrist and numbers during the abrupt draft periods on Sundays. Wame and Esperanza began a fair in secret, initially administration, advice about the movements and affairs of their owners. Their accord deepened slowly, anxiously with the backbone of bodies who accepted that a say would beggarly death. They arise through arrangement of songs and gestures that appeared to be annihilation added than archetypal bond-servant behavior to white observers, but agitated abundant letters about escape, routes, affable contacts, and opportunities for resistance. By backward 1715, they had developed what was conceivably the best adult intelligence arrangement in colonial South Carolina. Esperanza acclimated her position at the Rice Board Affairs to accumulate advice about convoying schedules, acknowledge changes, and acreage vulnerabilities. While Came acclimated his assignments, he was frequently loaned out to added plantations for abundant activity to authorize contacts throughout the region. They were planning article unprecedented. Not a simple escape attack that would abandon themselves, but accommodating insurgents that could potentially chargeless hundreds of disciplinarian aloft assorted plantations. They had articular affectionate whites, mapped out safe houses, and alike accustomed acquaintance with chargeless atramentous communities in Spanish Florida who could accommodate altar for able slaves, but their accurate planning was baffled by simple beastly emotion. On March 15, 1716, Edmund Greyfield arrives at the annual Rice Board affair that he had obsessively to aggrandize his ancestry program. He had articular several prime specimens amid his changeable disciplinarian, who would be commutual with males from added plantations to aftermath, what he alleged aloft animate stock. The affairs would activate anon with alleged females, actuality confused to a abstracted admixture breadth. They would be monitored consistently to ensure acknowledged pregnancies. Esperanza's name was at the top of his list. Aback, she overheard this chat, while confined wine to the board members. Her face remained impassive, but article axiological confused axial her. She had survived 15 years of bulwark by advancement hope. Achievement for freedom, achievement for revenge, achievement for a abutting breadth she could animate as a beastly actuality rather than property. Now Greyfield was planning to abate her to annihilation added than an ancestry animal. That night she met Com at their accepted spot, a burst cypress timber lane abysmal in the plantation's rice fields. Breadth the complete of their choir would be masked by the choir of insects and night birds. She told him about Greyfield's plan, and they both accepted what it meant. Once she was confused to the ancestry compound, their acquaintance would become impossible. Their intelligence arrangement would collapse, their planned insurgents would die afore it began, and desperate. They should run that actual night. He had fabricated acquaintance with a Spanish banker who could bootleg them to St. Augustine oral a week. They could be free, alpha a new life, maybe a like acquisition, a way to advice added disciplinarian from about safety. But Esperanza refused. Running saves us. She told him in their built-in Portuguese, a accent they acclimated, abandoned for their best clandestine conversations. But it changes annihilation for our people. These men will abide their evil, added ships will arrive, added families will be destroyed, added accouchement will abound up as property. She had spent 15 years watching these 14 men achieve decisions that afflicted bags of lives with adventitious cruelty. She had heard them beam about separations, altercate ache techniques like comestible recipes, and plan expansions of their operations that would accompany alike added adversity to bodies who looked like her. I acquire abstruse their patterns, she continued. I aperceive their secrets. I aperceive aback they are best vulnerable. We acquire one adventitious to accelerate a bulletin that will be remembered forever, one adventitious to achieve them, abashed the way they achieve us afraid. Accepted what she was suggesting, and he was terrified, not of death. Disciplinarian lived with the affiliated blackmail of death, but of the analytical ache that would announce beheading if they were caught. He had apparent what happened to disciplinarian who aloft their easily adjoin whites. The punishments were advised to serve as examples to breach the boos of every added bondservant who witnessed them. But he additionally accepted that Esperanza was right. Their planned escape would save 2 lives, while abrogation, the arrangement intact. Her addition was unthinkably dangerous, but it offered the achievability of article greater. A draft adjoin bulwark itself, that ability affect others, or at atomic, achieve bondservant owners, anticipate active about their adventitious cruelty. They spent the abutting 2 weeks adorning a plan that was allotment intelligence operation, allotment cerebral warfare, and allotment appropriate strike. Esperanza would use her admission to the annual Rice Board affair to actualize and befalling for adverse retaliation. Com would handle logistics, accepting materials, establishing alibis for affectionate slaves, and creating accident affairs for assorted scenarios. What they developed was conceivably the best adult act of bondservant attrition in colonial American history, and it all centered on a simple actuality that Esperanza had empiric over 15 years of service. The Rice Board Assembly were so assured in their complete ability that they had become absent-minded about their claimed security. The annual affair appointed for June 23, 1716, would be their last. June 23, 1716, dawned with the backbreaking califaction that fabricated South Carolina summers about abundant for anybody except those who had developed up with the altitude of a budding Africa. Esperanza woke afore Aurora, as she had every day for 15 years, and began her morning routine. But today was different. Today was the acme of 15 years of accurate observation, accurate planning, and suppressed rage. The annual Rice Board affair was appointed to activate at 2:00 in the afternoon, giving the 14 acreage owners time to biking to Grayfield acreage and conduct any basic business afore the bookish session. These affairs about lasted 4 to 6 hours, depending on the calendar and the bulk of alien rum that Edmund Grayfield provided for his guests. Esperanza had spent weeks acceptance the patterns of antecedent meetings, acquainted aggregate from basement arrange to bath breach to the timing of assorted calendar items. She knew that Marcus Sutton consistently accustomed Aboriginal to conduct clandestine business with Grayfield. She knew that Benjamin Fairfax had an anemic float and would alibi himself about every 90 minutes. She knew that the altercation of rice prices consistently happened afore banquet was served, while conversations about bondservant administration occurred afterwards aback. The rum had abandoned their tongues. Best importantly, she knew about the atramentous furnace. Grayfield acreage had been congenital in 1695, with a massive kitchen advised to augment, not abandon the capital house, but additionally the assorted overseers, craftsmen, and calm disciplinarians who lived on the property. The centerpiece of this kitchen was an astronomic atramentous fire boiler that had been alien from Britain at ample expense. Clashing the cops of fireplaces activate in best colonial homes, this boiler could advance acutely aerial temperatures for affiliated periods, authoritative it ideal for large-scale affable operations. The boiler stood about 8 ft alpine and 4 ft square, congenital of alien blaze brick, and amidst by adamant accessories for blind pots, acknowledging spits and acclimation air flow. Aback, absolutely stoked with coal, it could ability temperatures aloft 0 degrees F, hot abundant to baker chestnut and silver. Grayfield took astronomic pride in this furnace, generally assuming it to visitors as an archetype of his abundance and sophistication. What Grayfield didn't perceive was that Esperanza had been secretly acceptance the furnace's operation for months, acquirements how to ascendancy its temperature, how to advance best califaction for affiliated periods, and how to dispense its air breeze to actualize specific conditions. She had additionally been gradually stockpiling atramentous in a accumulator allowance abutting to the kitchen, cogent the overseers that Mr. Grayfield had ordered added ammunition for a planned amplification of affable operations. 3 canicule afore the meeting, Esperanza, accustomed adverse annual, that caked her boldness aloft any achievability of doubt. Wame had been sold. James Rutherford had obsessively that his acreage bare added acreage easily for an amplification activity, and he had assertive Greyfield to advertise him Boy Tom for 60 sterling. The transaction would be completed anon afterwards, the Rice Board affair, with actuality transferred to the Rutherford acreage the afterward morning. Aback Esperance abstruse of this sale, she accepted that her window of befalling was closing forever. In 3 days she would lose the man she loved, be affected into her ancestry affairs that would abort her spirit, and watch helplessly as the Rice Board affiliated its analytical brutalization of her people. The time for backbone had ended. That evening she met for what they both knew would be the aftermost time. They batten in whispers beside the burst cypress tree. Administration, 15 years of memory's aeroembolism into a few adored hours. Begged her, one final time, to carelessness her plan, and run abroad with him that actual night. There was still time to escape to Spanish Florida, still time to essay activity abroad from the abhorrence of acreage slavery. But Esperanza's apperception was fabricated up. These men acquire they are gods, she told him. They acquire they can do annihilation to us, afterwards consequence. Tomorrow I will actualization them they are wrong. I will actualization them that we are beastly beings, not animals, and that beastly beings action aback pushed aloft endurance. Accepted that arguing was useless. He had accepted Esperanza for beneath than 2 years, but he had abstruse to admit the animate in her articulation, aback, her apperception was absolutely fabricated up. Instead, he spent their actual time, allowance, her clarify the final accommodation of her plan. The abutting morning, June 22nd, Esperanza began her final preparations. She started by administering a complete annual of the kitchen and abutting accumulator areas, anecdotic every tool, ingredient, and actual that ability be useful. She paid accurate absorption to the adamant shackles and chains that were stored in the kitchen's pantry, accessories about acclimated for abstinent disciplinarian during punishment, but kept readily accessible throughout the plantation. She additionally fabricated accurate calendar of the kitchen's blueprint and the movement patterns of added disciplinarian throughout the day. The success of her plan would depend partly on ensuring that innocent disciplinarian were not present aback contest, abundant and partly on advancement, the actualization of accustomed operations, until the analytical moment arrived. Best importantly, she began advancing the atramentus furnace. Starting at dawn, she began agriculture atramentus into the boiler at anxiously timed intervals. Gradually accretion the centralized temperature, while advancement the actualization of accepted affable preparations. By backward morning, the boiler was abutting egal operating temperature, accessible to advance best calefaction for several hours. The added disciplinarian noticed annihilation abnormal about Esperanza's behavior. She had consistently been quiet and methodical in her work, and her affairs for the annual Rice Board affair appeared identical to her accepted for antecedent gatherings. She bankrupted the dining room, abiding the furniture, able confined dishes, and set up the alien bright glasses that Greyfield acclimated to affect his guests. But hidden in the kitchen, arranged were actuality fabricated that would transform a accepted business affair into article far added sinister. By apex on June 23, 1716, the aboriginal of the Rice Board Assembly had amorphous accession at Greyfield Estate. As always, Marcus Sutton, accustomed early, benumbed up the oak-lined admission that led to the capital abode with the aplomb of a man who endemic over 800 beastly beings, and advised himself accountable to no alluvial authority. Esperanza watched from the kitchen window as Sutton dismounted his horse and handed the reins to a abiding slave. At 53 years old, Sutton was one of the beforehand assembly of the Rice Council, and his essay showed the furnishings of decades of affluent living. He was heavily congenital with a Brazian gray beard, and the ashamed appearance of a man who drank, added alien rum, then was anxiously healthy. But his eyes remained aciculate and calculating. The eyes of addition who had congenital his affluence by examination, beastly beings as bold to be bought, sold, and exploited with best efficiency. Sutton's acreage specialized in what was euphemistically alleged seasoning. The barbarous action of breaking a new, accustomed African disciplinarian and teaching them to acquire their action as abiding and inescapable. Disciplinarian who accepted decidedly aggressive to condiment were generally awash to Sutton, who had developed added artistic methods for antibacterial their will to resist. His techniques had become so aesthetic that added acreage owners consistently beatific their botheration disciplinarian to his operation, advantageous exceptional prices for his services. Edmund Greyfield greeted Sutton at the advanced aperture with the busy address that acreage owners aloof for anniversary added while alleviative their disciplinarian-like leavestock. The two men retired to Greyfield's clandestine, in abstraction to altercate business affairs that were too acute for the above group, primarily new techniques for bondservant ascendancy and strategies for lobbying the colonial government to abate restrictions on bondservant importation. Over the abutting hour, the actual 12 assembly of the rice board accustomed in babyish groups, their carriages and horses creating a cottage jam about the annular drive that fronted the capital house. Esperanza accustomed anniversary man as he arrived, accepting served at abundant affairs to aperceive their faces, their voices, and their accurate areas of ability in the administration of beastly property. William Petton, accustomed with his accepted aggregation of armed overseers, a anticipation he had adopted afterwards a contempo bondservant apostasy attack on his acreage had been about suppressed. James Rutherford came alone, but his horse bore the characteristic silver-mounted pistols that advertised his bifold role as acreage buyer and colonial magistrate. Henry Caldwell Catholic, in an elaborately busy accustomed that displayed his family's covering of arms, affected affectation that accent his political admission and amusing ambitions. Anniversary accession was greeted with the aforementioned august courtesy, the aforementioned barter of pleasantries about acclimate and crops, and the assiduous Indian botheration forth the frontier. These men saw themselves as the founding fathers of a abundant civilization, antecedents who were transforming a wilderness into advantageous agronomical acreage that would augment the growing cities of colonial America. What they banned to exceed was that their acculturation was congenital on a foundation of analytical brutality, that their abundance came from the contributed activity of bags of beastly beings who were advised worse than livestock, and that their political admission existed primarily to bolster and aggrandize this arrangement of exploitation. At 2:00 precisely, Edmund Greyfield alleged the annual affair to adjustment in his bookish dining room. The 14 men took their accepted seats about a massive oak table that had been alien from England at an amount that would acquire accurate archetypal colonial ancestors for several years. The table's able apparent reflected the ablaze from dozens of candles abiding in argent candelabras, creating an atmosphere of abundance and composure that able their faculty of a head and entitlement. Esperanza began confine the meal with her accepted efficiency, effective silently about the table as these men discussed the business of bulwark with the adventitious atrocity that had characterized their antecedent 180 annual meetings. She had heard variations of these conversations hundreds of times, but today she listened with accurate absorption to every word, every tone, every adventitious advertence to beastly suffering. The calendar began as consistently with the altercation of rice prices in the Charleston Bazaar and strategies for maximizing profits in the advancing autumn season. William Petton arised that his acreage had accomplished almanac assembly levels by implementing what he alleged incentive-based management, an arrangement that provided basal aliment rewards for disciplinarian who exceeded circadian quotas, while subjecting underperformers to analytical punishment. The key, Patton explained while acid his alien beef, is authoritative them acquire that their abundance akin depends absolutely on their productivity. Accord them aloof, abundant achievement to accumulate working, but never abundant aegis to achieve them complacent. James Rutherford nodded approvingly. I've had accomplished after effects with Ancestors Breach as a motivational tool. Annihilation makes a acreage duke assignment harder than animate that his wife and accouchement are actuality captivated at an altered location, and that alliance depends on constant performance. The chat affiliated in this attitude for about an hour, with anniversary affiliate administration techniques for extracting best activity from their beastly acreage while aspersing costs for food, housing, and medical care. They discussed ancestry programs with the aforementioned analytic disengagement that beasts ranchers acclimated aback planning livestock improvements. They compared addendum on abuse techniques with the activity of craftsman administration, able secrets. Esperanza refilled wine glasses and austere plates, while these men acclaimed their latest innovations in beastly degradation. She maintained her accepted advertisement of bare subservience, but axial her perception she was authoritative final brainy addendum about anniversary man's position, anniversary man's habits, and anniversary man's abeyant for attrition, aback the time came. As the bookish calendar concluded, and the chat became added informal, the men began administration acceptance that arise the accurate base of their cruelty. Marcus Sutton declared a new ache accessory he had alien from the Caribbean, a metal cage about ample, abundant for a beastly assay that was abeyant in abounding sunlight and could absolutely bake a alienated disciplinarian to afterlife over a eon of several days. Samuel Kingsley boasted about his latest ancestry experiment, which circuitous forcibly bond alleged disciplinarian to aftermath what he hoped would be a new bearing of larger, stronger acreage hands, but it was George Baxter, the youngest affiliate of the council, who provided the final agitator for what was about to unfold. Gentlemen, Baxter arise as Esperanza, caked brandy for the post, dinner drinks. I acquire agitative annual about a new business opportunity. The Spanish are advantageous exceptional prices for accomplished disciplinarian in their South American territories. I'm proposing that we cull our assets to acquirement an ample address and activate analytical exportation of our older, beneath advantageous stock. The allowance erupted in agog altercation as the 14 men began artful. The abeyant profits from affairs, their beastly acreage to Spanish colonies' breadth, animate altitude, were alike added barbarous than those in South Carolina. They debated logistics, discussed political admission who could facilitate the all-important permits, and estimated how abounding disciplinarian they could consign while advancement able activity armament for their plantations. As Esperanza listened to these men plan the abolition of alike added lives, she acquainted article axial her snap. For 15 years she had maintained her acumen by cogent herself that their animality had limits, that alike these angry men would eventually admit some boundaries of beastly decency, but there were no limits. There were no boundaries. Their accommodation for causing adversity was accountable abandoned by bread and butter considerations and their own imagination. It was time to actualization them what it acquainted like to be powerless. At absolutely 9:47 p.m., according to the alien German alarm that stood in Greyfield's dining room, Esperanza de Lima fabricated her move. The 14 assembly of the rice board had accomplished their bookish business and acclimatized into the adequate after-chat that about assured their annual meetings. The allowance was balmy with assay calefaction and candle ablaze, abounding with the aroma of alien tobacco and big-ticket brandy. Best of the men had abandoned their bookish accoutrements and adopted the airy aspect of bodies who believed themselves absolutely defended in their dominance. They were discussing Samuel Kingsley's angle to authorize a bookish ancestry anthology that would clue bloodlines aloft all their plantations, creating what they envisioned as a aloft chic of disciplinarian, accurately bred, intelligence, strength, and docility, the chat had become technical, about academic, as they debated abiogenetic attack with the aforementioned alone absorption, the ability accompany to discussions of crop circling or clay improvement. None of them noticed aback Esperanza absolved herself from the dining room, evidently to retrieve added brandy from the kitchen. None of them empirical, accurate movements as she anchored every avenue from the capital abode, except the kitchen door. None of them accomplished that she had been gradually accretion the atramentous furnace's temperature throughout the evening, bringing it to a calefaction akin that would acquire been alarming alike for affable purposes. Her plan was effected in its artlessness and alarming in its implications. Over the antecedent several days, she had acclimated her admission to the estate's accumulator areas to position adamant shackles and chains at cardinal locations throughout the house. These abstemiousness devices, commonly acclimated for back-breaking alienated slaves, were now broadcast in such a way that she could apprentice defended anyone she encountered. She had additionally appropriate admixture based on ability, anesthetized bottom-word from her grandmother, an aggregate of bounded herbs that could seed addition benumbed oral annual if captivated through aliment or drink. This admixture had been anxiously added to the brandy canteen that she had been confined throughout the evening, as the Rice Board Assembly affiliated their altercation of beastly ancestry programs. The aboriginal furnishings of Esperanza's alertness began to manifest. George Baxter, who had captivated added brandy than the others, began to feel addled and disoriented. He attributed this to the calefaction and alcohol, but oral annual he was crumbling in his chair, advancing to advance consciousness. One by one, the added board assembly began experiencing agnate symptoms. William Pettit complained of abrupt nausea. James Rutherford activated himself clumsy to focus his eyes. Marcus Suttons easily began abashed uncontrollably. Edmund Greyfield was the aboriginal to apprehend that article was actively wrong. Gentlemen, he said, his articulation already slurring slightly, I acquire we may acquire bin, addition has, but afore he could complete the thought, his legs gave way, and he burst to assimilate the alien Persian carpeting that had amount him added than best colonists acceptable in a year. Oral 20 minutes, all 14 assembly of the Rice Board were unconscious. Esperanza, formed with methodical efficiency, application braiding, and adamant shackles to defended anniversary man's easily and feet. The restraints she activated were the aforementioned accessories that had been acclimated to bind bags of disciplinarian over the years. Accessories advised to annual affliction and anticipate escape, while befitting the victim animate and functional. She took accurate affliction to ensure that anniversary bounden was apprenticed abundant to annual ample discomfort, but not so akin as to cut off apportionment entirely. She had no ambition of acceptance. These men escaped through the benevolence of quick death. As she worked, she battened to anniversary benumbed man in Portuguese, Spanish, and burst English, sometimes answer what she was doing, sometimes annual specific instances of animality she had witnessed, sometimes artlessly cogent the acerbity that had been architecture axial her for 15 years. You advertise my quam like he is cow. She aside to James Rutherford as she anchored adamant shackles about his ankles. You buy and advertise bodies like they are nothing. Tonight you apprentice what it feels like to be nothing. To Marcus Sutton, she said, you breach spirits. You advise bodies to stop actuality human. Tonight I advise you what burst spirit feels like. To Edmund Greyfield, her articulation agitated 15 years of suppressed hatred. You own me. You anticipate you can do whatever you appetite to me. You anticipate I am animal. Tonight you see what animals do aback. They acquire no best left. Once all 14 men were deeply restrained, Esperanza began the best labor-intensive allotment of her plan. One by one, she abject anniversary benumbed assay from the dining allowance through the abode to the kitchen. This action took about 3 hours, as anniversary man advised appreciably added than she did, and she had to move anxiously to abstain authoritative babble, that ability active added disciplinarian or overseers who ability still be awake. By 2:00 a.m., all 14 assembly of the Rice Board were abiding in an amphitheater about the massive atramentous furnace. their anxiety pointing adjoin the center, their easily anchored abaft their backs with adamant shackles, their mouths blimp with raw affection to anticipate them from calling for advice aback, they regained consciousness. The boiler itself had been stoked to best temperature, and was beaming calefaction that fabricated the kitchen about abundant alike for addition who wasn't restrained. Esperanza had afflicted that the aggregate of acute heat, dehydration, and belted movement would actualize a essay of abiding ache that would accord these men time to contemplate their fate while boring dying in agony, but she had additionally fabricated accoutrement for added actual essay of justice. As the aboriginal grey ablaze of aurora began clarification through the kitchen windows, the rice board assembly began regaining consciousness. The assembled admixture she had acclimated was advised to annul a sleep for several hours, but leave no abiding impairment, ensuring that her victims would be absolutely acquainted of their bearings. Aback the ache began. Edmund Greyfield was the aboriginal to death watch up, and his abashing apprentice angry to alarm as he accomplished his predicament. He was lying on the bean attic of his own kitchen, apprenticed duke and bottom with adamant shackles, clumsy to a ledge because of the affection blimp in his mouth, and amidst by the added assembly of his board in agnate condition, the massive atramentous boiler in the centermost of their amphitheater was beaming calefaction like a miniature adaptation of hell itself. As the added men regained consciousness, the kitchen abounding with the complete of deadened screams and atrocious struggles, adjoined adamantine restraints. They were experiencing for the aboriginal time in their lives the complete helplessness that they had inflicted on bags of added beastly beings. Esperanza sat calmly in a bend of the kitchen, absolutely acid the abstraction knives she acclimated for aliment preparation. She had positioned herself so that anniversary man could see her clearly, and she maintained eye acquaintance with anniversary of them as they absolutely grasped the abasement of their situation. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in bright English, far bigger English than she had any time arise in their attendance before. "I achievement you adequate well, we acquire abundant to discuss, and I appetite to achieve abiding you are all advantageous attention." She stood up and absolved boring about the circle, adorable bottomward at anniversary aseptic man, with the aforementioned advertisement of algid appraisal that they had acclimated a back analytical disciplinarian at the Charleston market. "For 15 years I acquire served your meetings, I acquire listened to your conversations, I acquire heard you altercate my bodies like we are beasts to be bought and awash and bred and collapsed according to your convenience." She paused abutting to Marcus Sutton, who was advancing aimlessly adjoin his restraints. "You, Mr. Sutton, specialize in breaking spirits? You booty bodies who still bethink actuality beastly and advise them to forget. You acquire able techniques for antibacterial hope, for authoritative, appreciative men and women into alveolate shells who abide abandoned to serve your pleasure." She confused to James Rutherford. "You, Mr. Rutherford, use ancestors' breach as a apparatus of control. You advisedly abort the bonds amid parents and children, amid husbands and wives, because you acquire abstruse that bodies afterwards families are easier to control." She affiliated about the circle acclamation anniversary man by name, and annual specific acts of animality that she had witnessed or heard declared during their annual meetings. With anniversary recitation, the men's struggles became added desperate, and their deadened cries added frantic. Finally, she alternate to Edmund Greyfield. "And you, Mr. Greyfield, are the affliction of all because you could acquire." Alleged differently, you acquire education, you acquire wealth, you acquire power. You could acquire advised us as beastly beings. Instead, you chose to be a monster because actuality a monster was added profitable. She absolved aback to the centermost of the circle, continuing anon in advance of the atramentous furnace. "Today you are activity to acquaintance what it feels like to be powerless. You are activity to apprentice what it agency to be at the benevolence of addition who angle you as beneath than human. and your activity to die slowly, painfully, with affluence of time to anticipate about all the adversity you acquire caused. With that announcement, Esperanza began the final appearance of her plan. What happened over the abutting 6 hours would become the actuality of fable and daydream throughout colonial South Carolina. Admitting the abounding accommodation would abide active in closed government Athenaeum for added than 2 centuries. Esperanza de Lima adapted the Grayfield acreage kitchen into an amphitheater of avengement breadth. 14 of the colony's best able men accomplished for the aboriginal and aftermost time what it meant to be absolutely abandoned in the easily of addition who beheld them as beneath than human. She began with cerebral torture, effective boring about the amphitheater and banishment anniversary man to accept as she anecdotal in acute detail specific instances of animality that she had witnessed during her 15 years of servitude. She declared accouchements burst from their mother's arms, husbands afar from wives, appreciative men bargained to burst shells through analytical brutalization. She battened in the calm, abstinent accent that these men about acclimated aback, discussing the administration of their beastly property. "Mr. Petton," she said, admiration beside the abashed acreage owner, "do you bethink the woman alleged Asher? She was abundant aback. You bought her in 1714. You formed her in the rice fields until the day she went into labor, again awash her babyish to a banker from Georgia, afore she alike recovered from childbirth. She cried for 3 canicules straight. You told your ambassador to whip her for boundless babble that was advancing your sleep." Peon's eyes widened with alarm as he accustomed the incident. Like best acreage owners, he had committed so abounding acts of adventitious animality that alone cases attenuated calm in his memory. But Esperanza had remembered every detail, every name, every act of analytical dehumanization that she had witnessed. She confused to Charles Warwick. "You adore watching punishments, Mr. Warwick. You arise whippings like added men arise horse races. Aftermost spring, you paid Mr. Grayfield $5 to let you alone administrate 50 lashes to a man who had approved to run away. You took your time, agreement the achievement, so he would abide acquainted for the complete punishment. You smiled the accomplished time. The calefaction from the atramentous boiler was acceptable, unbearable. Sweat caked bottomward the faces of the aseptic men, bond with tears of alarm and creating aphotic stains on their big-ticket alien clothing. Several of them had already amorphous assuming signs of calefaction exhaustion, accelerated breathing, a blazed skin, and the anesthetized attending that preceded collapse. But Esperanza was not accomplished with the cerebral allocation of her retribution. She retrieved a leather-bound antithesis from Edmund Grayfield's study. The aforementioned book breadth he recorded the purchase, sale, and ancestry of his beastly property. Opening it to an adventitious page, she began annual entries aloud in the flat, blank accent that acreage owners acclimated aback, discussing business transactions. April 12th, 1715, a washboy alleged Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford acreage for ancestry purposes, 45 lb sterling. Note, mother became annoying afterwards separation. Recommend actual auction or disposal. She angry the page. June 3rd, 1715, changeable alleged Rebecca died in childbirth, child survived, estimated accident 20 lb sterling. Note, implement bigger diet affairs for ancestry females to abate bloodshed rates. Folio afterwards page, she apprehend the analytic affidavit of beastly suffering. Families destroyed, accouchements sold. Men and women bargain to budgetary calculations in a businessman's ledger. Anniversary admission represented someone's life, someone's family, someone's dreams ashamed beneath the weight of analytical exploitation. The cerebral ache, affiliated for 2 hours with Esperanza banishment anniversary man, to accost the abounding ambit of his crimes, adjoin humanity. She had an amazing anamnesis for detail, added by 15 years of accurate absorption to their conversations. She could anamnesis specific dates, alone names, accurate acts of animality that anniversary man had committed or ordered. But as the morning sun climbed college, and the temperature in the kitchen approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit, she confused to the abutting appearance of her plan. From the kitchen accumulator area, she retrieved several affiliated adamant rods, accoutrement about acclimated for stoking the atramentous boiler and manipulating abundant cookware. She placed these rods anon into the furnace's flames. Breadth they apprenticed acrimonious to blooming red temperatures that would annual acute burns on acquaintance with beastly flesh. Gentlemen, she announced, you acquire spent years perfecting techniques for causing affliction, afterwards causing actual death. You acquire abstruse how to ache bodies for best after effect while befitting them animate and functional. Today I will authenticate that your acceptance acquire been advantageous attention. She withdrew the aboriginal adamant rod from the furnace. The metal glowed like a allotment of captured sunlight, beaming calefaction that could be acquainted from several anxiety away. Effective to Edmund Greyfield, she captivated the rod abutting abundant to his face, that he could feel the acute calefaction afterwards authoritative contact. This is for every bondservant you acquire branded like cattle, she said calmly. This is for every beastly actuality you acquire, apparent as your property. What happened abutting was too barbarous to call in detail, but the screams that echoed through the Greyfield acreage kitchen could be heard by disciplinarian animate in fields about a division mile away. The complete was clashing annihilation they had any time heard before, the desperate, aching cries of men who had never accomplished 18, carat helplessness and were advertent what their victims had endured for decades. Esperanza formed methodically, applying the acrimonious adamant to anniversary man in turn, targeting non-fatal areas that would annual best affliction while ensuring that her victims remained acquainted and aware. She had abstruse from celebratory their own ache techniques, compassionate absolutely how abundant accident the beastly assay could sustain, while still advancement the accommodation for suffering. Amid applications of the acrimonious iron, she affiliated her cerebral assault, anecdotic in detail how anniversary man's acreage would be affiliated by ancestors who ability not abide their atrocious practices. She talked about their children, apprehensive aloud whether the abutting bearing would prove as angry as their fathers or ability advance some accommodation for beastly compassion. Your son, William, she said to Marcus Sutton as he writhed in agony, he is abandoned 16 years old. Maybe there is still time for him to become a bigger man than his father. Maybe aback he learns what happened to you, he will adjudge that alleviative bodies as acreage is too dangerous. The cerebral impulse was as adverse as the concrete torture. These men had congenital their complete character about the acceptance that they were aloft beings, accustomed masters who had the appropriate to ascendancy and accomplishment added beastly beings. Esperanza was systematically antibacterial that identity, banishment them to acquaintance themselves as victims, as alter to be manipulated by addition else's will, as the afternoon calefaction accumulated with the furnace's radiation to advance the kitchen temperature aloft 130 degrees, several of the men began assuming signs of astringent calefaction stroke. Their bark angry red and dry, their breath became accelerated and bank, and their struggles adjoin the restraints became weaker and added desperate. But Esperanza had planned for this contingency. She had no ambition of acceptance them to escape through a sleep or calefaction-induced delirium. Application techniques abstruse from her grandmother, she activated wet cloths to their foreheads and affected babyish amounts of baptize into their mouths, befitting them acquainted, while their bodies boring adapted in the superheated air. You charge, break awake, she told them. You charge, abide, alert. Afterlife is a mercy, and you acquire not acceptable benevolence yet. The ache affiliated through the hottest allotment of the afternoon with Esperanza advancement, the boiler at best temperature, while systematically applying acrimonious adamant rods to anniversary man's body. She targeted hands, feet, and faces, areas that would annual acute affliction while actual arresting as abiding reminders of their experience. But conceivably the best adverse aspect of the complete affliction was not the concrete suffering, but the complete changeabout of ability relationships that it represented. For the aboriginal time in their lives, these 14 men were experiencing what their disciplinarian endured every day, the ability that addition beastly actuality had complete ascendancy over their bodies, their comfort, their actual survival. They were requirements what it meant to be property, as Atramentus approached and caliginosity began falling aloft the kitchen floor. Esperanza able for the final act of her anxiously orchestrated revenge. The Atramentus boiler had been afire at best temperature for about 18 hours, creating a calefaction akin that was absolutely abundant for abiding beastly exposure. She began boring the semi-conscious men afterpiece to the furnace, accessioned them so that the acute calefaction would boring baker their bodies while befitting them animate affiliated abundant to absolutely exceed their fate. It was an address she had heard Marcus Sutton call during one of the Rice Board meetings, an adjustment he acclimated for back-breaking. Disciplinarian who attempted escape. "This is how you dead, Thomas," she told Sutton as she positioned his essay oral 3FD of the aglow coals. "Remember Thomas, the adolescent man who approved to run abroad after most summer? You put him in a metal cage in complete sunlight, and let him baker boring over 3 days. He begged for water, he begged for shade, he begged for death. You abandoned all his pleas because you capital added disciplinarian to attestant his suffering. One by one, she abiding all 14 men in positions breadth the furnace's beaming calefaction would boring annihilate them, while abrogation them acquainted affiliated abundant to contemplate their crimes. The cerebral impulse was as important to her as the concrete destruction. She capitaled them to acquire with complete accuracy that they were dying because of choices they had made, accomplishments they had taken, and lives they had destroyed. As the sun set on June 24th, 1716, the kitchen of Greyfield Acreage independent 14 dying men who were experiencing for the aboriginal and aftermost time what it acquainted like to be absolutely blank in the easily of addition, who beheld them as beneath than human. The agreeable had chalk, full several hours earlier, replaced by the weaker sounds of men whose articulate chords had been damaged by abiding crying. The kitchen abounding with the aroma of a fire beef, and the complete of affected breath, as 14 of Colonial South Carolina's best able citizens boring broiled to afterlife beside the aforementioned boiler they had acclimated to adapt commons served by the bodies they had enslaved. Esperanza sat in her corner, still absolutely acid kitchen knives, animate the Portuguese lullaby that her mother had articulate to her in the apple that Portuguese raiders had destroyed 20 years earlier. She was no best adorable at the dying men, but her aerial remained active to their breathing, ensuring that none of them able into a sleep afore experiencing the abounding admeasurement of amends she had planned. As midnight approached, the aftermost of the Rice Board assembly assuredly succumbed to the aggregate of heat, dehydration, and burns that had been boring killing them throughout the day. Edmund Greyfield was the final survivor, his architecture adequate by years of affluent active and medical affliction that had never been accessible to his slaves. His aftermost articular words arise in a buzz about oral aloft, the complete of a fire at Trementus, were he effecting attack at bargaining. "Please, I can accord you money, freedom, whatever you want." Esperanza looked at him with the aforementioned advertisement of balmy absorption that he had acclimated a back analytical disciplinarian at the Charleston market. "I appetite you to die animate that you were wrong," she replied calmly. "You are not superior. You are not alleged by God. You are not an accustomed master. You are aloof a man who chose to be evil, and now you are advantageous the amount for that choice." Those were the aftermost words that Edmund Greyfield heard afore the calefaction and aridity assuredly claimed his life. Aurora bankrupt on June 25th, 1716, complete arena that would abode the survivors for the draft of their lives. Aback, the added acreage disciplinarian began their morning routines, they credible 14 broiled corpses abiding in a complete amphitheater about the massive Atramentus boiler in the Greyfield acreage kitchen. The bodies were about apparent as human, bargained to begrimed shells by 18 hours of acknowledgement to acute heat. Esperanza de Lima was activate sitting calmly at the kitchen table, absolutely acid abstraction knives, while animate a addictive melody that none of the added disciplinarian recognized. She showed no signs of ache or exhaustion, admitting accepting orchestrated and witnessed one of the best busy acts of animus in colonial American history. Aback the plantation's white overseers accustomed to investigate, they activate an arena that defied their compassionate of the accustomed order. 14 of the colony's best able men had been dead by a distinct bondservant woman who had somehow baffled them all and subjected them to a assay of ache that exceeded annihilation in their experience. The implications were terrifying. If one bondservant could achieve this akin of confusion, adjoin assorted acreage owners, what ability arise if disciplinarian began acclimation added adult forms of resistance? The cerebral, a pulse on the white colonial citizenry was actual and profound. For the aboriginal time, they began to abhorrence the bodies they had enslaved. Chat of the annihilation advanced throughout the antecedents' oral days, agitated by writers who had been accomplished to acquaint the victims' families and business associates. But the colonial authorities faced an austere bind-in-chief how to accede to the incident. On one hand, they bear to authenticate that bondservant apostasy would be met with abrupt and barbarous retaliation. The complete acreage arrangement depended on advancement, the disciplinarian acceptance that attrition was abortive, and that white ascendancy was complete and permanent. On the added hand, they bear to anticipate the advance of abundant advice about Esperanza's methods and success. If added disciplinarian abstruse that 14 acreage owners could be dead by a distinct woman armed abandoned with intelligence, patience, and determination, the after effects could be adverse further. Complete colonial economy. Governor Robert Johnson convened an emergency affair of the Colonial Board to altercate the crisis. Afterwards, 3 canicule of acrimonious debate, they accomplished an accommodation that prioritized political adherence over accessible justice. The official annal of the Greyfield annihilation were closed by gubernatorial adjustment and apprenticed in the Charleston Athenaeum with instructions that they not be opened for 50 years. Families of the victims were abreast that their ancestors had died in an adverse blaze that had captivated the Greyfield acreage kitchen during a business meeting. No acknowledgement was fabricated of Esperanza's role in their deaths. Esperanza herself presented an added circuitous problem. Executing her about would crave answer her crimes, which would advance absolutely the affectionate of advice that the colonial government capital to suppress, but acceptance her to animate would accelerate the bulletin that bondservant apostasy could accomplish afterwards consequences. The ban they devised was as atrocious as it was politically expedient. Esperanza was bedeviled to be awash to a Spanish banker who specialized in bartering disciplinarian to the argent mines of South America, a fate that was universally accepted to be a delayed afterlife sentence. The animate altitude in the Spanish mines were so barbarous that disciplinarian about survived beneath than 2 years afore accedence to exhaustion, disease, or accidents. But alike this book agitated risks. If Esperanza managed to survive affiliated abundant to allotment her adventure with added slaves, she could become an attribute of acknowledged attrition, that ability affect added rebellions. The colonial authorities apparent this botheration by ensuring that Esperanza would never ability the Spanish mines alive. On July 15, 1716, absolutely 3 weeks afterwards the Greyfield massacre, Esperanza de Lima was loaded assimilate, a Spanish trading barge alleged the Santa Isabella that was apprenticed for Cartagena. The ship's captain had been secretly instructed to ensure that she did not survive the voyage, but to achieve her afterlife arise accidental. The Santa Isabella, ancient Charleston harbor, on the Atramentus tide. Accustomed 43, added disciplinarian, forth with Esperanza. According to the ship's official log, she died of agitation on the third day of the boating and was active at sea according to accepted amphibian practice. But there were rumors. Some of the actual disciplinarian from the Greyfield acreage claimed that Esperanza had a rise of accident, affairs of allies in the Spanish territories who would advise her escape if she could survive the ocean voyage. Others aside that she had been apparent speaking with chargeless Atramentus sailors in Charleston Harbor, possibly alignment for abetment during the trip. Best significantly, several disciplinarian arise that Esperanza had spent her final weeks at the estate, teaching added calm workers about herbs, about anatomy, about the weaknesses of their masters, and the vulnerabilities of the acreage system. Amends burns slower than coal, she had told them, but burns complete. The blaze, I started, will advance to added kitchens, added plantations, added masters who anticipate they are safe. Whether these rumors independent any accuracy was absurd to determine. The colonial authorities had confused apprentice to banish the actual disciplinarian from Greyfield estate, affairs them to plantations throughout the arena to anticipate any allocation of their acceptance or their activities, but the cerebral accident was already done. In the months afterward, the Greyfield massacre, a beachcomber of agitation, swept through the bondservant communities of South Carolina. There were no added accumulation killings like Esperanza's methodical beheading of the Rice Board members, but acreage owners began advertisement, an aberrant alternation of abate incidents that appropriate accommodating resistance. Kitchen fires destroyed several acreage houses beneath apprehensive circumstances. Valuable livestock died mysteriously afterwards, arresting augment that may acquire been poisoned. White overseers suffered abnormal accidents at absolutely the moments aback they were best vulnerable. Accoutrement and weapons abolished from accumulator areas, abandoned to be activate canicule afterwards in locations that appropriate bondservant involvement. Best advancing to the colonial authorities, disciplinarian began demonstrating ability of their owners, claimed habits, business arrangements, and ancestors' relationships that went far aloft what their duties should acquire provided. It was as if an intelligence arrangement had developed throughout the acreage, arrangement with advice abounding advisedly amid backdrop that had ahead been abandoned from anniversary other. The cerebral impulse on the white colonial citizenry was abstruse and lasting. Acreage owners who had ahead confused through their backdrop with adventitious aplomb, now Catholic with armed escorts, and abhorred anticipated routines. The annual affairs that had been a cornerstone of the Rice Council's allocation were abeyant indefinitely, as no one capital to accumulate in ample groups that ability present adorable targets for revenge. Some acreage owners began modifying their assay of slaves, not out of moral awakening, but from applied fear. If disciplinarian were able of the affectionate of adult planning and beheading that Esperanza had demonstrated, again advancement their adherence through hardly bigger assay ability, be astute. Advance in claimed security, but added owners confused in the adverse direction, implementing alike harsher controls and punishments in an attack to alarm their disciplinarian into submission. These plantations accomplished collegianity of escape attempts, assignment slowdowns, and abstruse accidents that appropriate their strategies were backfiring. The colonial government responded by implementing new laws that belted bondservant movement, banned gatherings of added than 3 disciplinarian afterwards white supervision, and allowable accurate penalties for any bondservant bent with weapons or accoutrement that could be acclimated as weapons. But these laws were difficult to accomplish aloft the broadcast acreage arrangement, and they may acquire absolutely encouraged added adult forms of attrition by active bondservant alignment underground. Conceivably best significantly, the adventure of Esperanza de Lima began circulating through the arrangement of chargeless Atramentus communities, underground railroad stations, and affectionate white abolitionists who were alpha to adapt action to slavery. Her name became an attribute of attrition that aggressive added acts of apostasy throughout the American colonies. Historians would afterwards agitation whether the Greyfield annihilation represented an abandoned adventure of a lone animus or the alpha of an added analytical assay of bondservant attrition that contributed to the closing collapse of the acreage system. The closed colonial annal fabricated complete assay impossible, but the amplified affirmation appropriate that Esperanza's accomplishments had aggressive copycat incidents throughout the South. In 1739, 23 years afterwards, the Greyfield Massacre, the Stono apostasy erupted in South Carolina, the bigger bondservant insurgents in colonial American history. While the specific admission to Esperanza's accomplishments could not be proven, some of the rebellion's leaders were disciplinarian who had formed on plantations that were affiliated to the Aboriginal Rice Board Network. The apostasy was eventually suppressed, but it proved that the cerebral impulse of the Greyfield annihilation had not achromatic with time. Disciplinarian throughout the arena had abstrused that their masters were not invulnerable, that accurate planning could affect aloft numbers and weapons, and that acts of attrition could accomplish alike adjoin acutely absurd odds. As the years passed and the American Revolution adapted the political mural of the colonies, the adventure of Esperanza de Lima became allotment of the articulate attitude that abiding bondservant communities through their darkest hours. Parents told their accouchement about the woman who had fabricated 14 masters pay for their crimes. Adolescent disciplinarian abstruse that attrition was possible, that intelligence and backbone could be added able than concrete strength, and that amends ability be delayed but would eventually arrive. The closed annal in Charleston's Athenaeum remained unopened for absolutely 50 years, as Governor Johnson had ordered. Aback, they were assuredly fabricated accessible to advisors in 1766. The American colonies were in the bosom of political about-face that would advance to ability from Britain. The adventure of the Greyfield annihilation was overshadowed by above actual events, but it contributed to a growing acquaintance that the Academy of Bulwark, independent the seeds of its own destruction. By the time the United States architecture was ratified in 1788, the acreage arrangement that had seemed so abiding and bulletproof in 1716 was already assuming signs of centralized accent that would eventually breach the nation apart. The cerebral impulse of animate that disciplinarian could organize, plan, and assassinate adult acts of attrition had fundamentally afflicted the accord amid adept and slave. The masters were no best assured in their complete power. The disciplinarian were no best assertive of their complete powerlessness. And in that about face of cerebral antithesis lay the alpha of the end of American slavery. In the years that followed the Greyfield massacre, whispers of the accuracy began to appear from the best abrupt sources. A Spanish ship's clerk autograph in his clandestine annual during a boating to Cartagena in backward 1716 recorded an amazing chat with a Portuguese-speaking woman who had been secretly transferred from the Santa Isabella during an accumulation stop in Havana. According to the clerk's account, this woman battened with arresting intelligence about the acreage arrangement in South Carolina, anecdotic in complete detail the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of alone acreage owners throughout the colony. She claimed to acquire orchestrated what she alleged the aboriginal lesson, but appropriate that it would not be the last. The blaze that began in one kitchen, she reportedly told the clerk, will advance to abounding kitchens. The acquaint, I abstruse from watching masters at their angry assignment, are now actuality accomplished to new students. Oh, whether this woman was absolutely Esperanza de Lima could never be confirmed, but colonial annal from Spanish Florida began documenting the accession of almighty abreast able disciplinarian who bedeviled abundant ability of acreage operations throughout the British territories. These refugees seemed to acquire admission to an intelligence arrangement that affiliated far aloft what alone escapees should acquire known. Advancing to the colonial authorities, letters began clarification aback from Spanish territories, anecdotic communities of aloft disciplinarian who were actively acknowledging escape attempts and attrition activities in the British colonies. Bellatrist intercepted by colonial admiral, independent abundant instructions for anecdotic affectionate contacts, alienated convoying routes, and based the cerebral vulnerabilities of acreage owners who had developed absent-minded in their confidence. By 1720, aloof 4 years afterwards the Greyfield Massacre, the colonial government was affected to exceed that bondservant attrition had acquired aloft alone escape attempts into article abutting. Organized warfare, acreage owners throughout South Carolina began advertisement accommodating incidents that appropriate analytical planning and intelligence gathering. Kitchen fires destroyed several acreage houses beneath affairs that defied accustomed explanation. Valuable livestock died mysteriously afterwards, arresting augment that appeared to acquire been advisedly poisoned. White overseers suffered baleful accidents at moments aback. They were best abandoned and vulnerable. Best abashing of all, disciplinarian began demonstrating ability of their masters, claimed habits, business relationships, and ancestors' secrets that went far aloft what their assigned duties should acquire revealed. It was as if an airy arrangement had developed throughout the acreage arrangement, with advice abounding advisedly amid backdrop that had ahead been abandoned from anniversary other. The cerebral transformation was abstruse and lasting. Acreage owners who had confused through their backdrop with adventitious heirs, now Catholic with armed escorts, and abhorred anticipated routines. The annual gatherings that had been axial to the Rice Council's allocation were assuredly suspended. As no one capital to present an adorable ambition for accommodating revenge, some masters began modifying their assay of slaves, not from moral awakening, but from applied terror. If their beastly acreage was able of the adult planning and beheading that had destroyed the Rice Council, again advancement adherence through hardly bigger altitude ability be astute advance in claimed survival, but added acreage owners responded with added brutality, implementing harsher punishments and added akin controls in atrocious attempts to alarm their disciplinarian into complete submission. These plantations accomplished college ante of abstruse accidents, assignment slowdowns, and escape attempts that appropriate their strategies were accepting the adverse effect. The colonial government imposed new laws akin bondservant movement, prohibiting gatherings and mandating astringent penalties for any bondservant activate with abeyant weapons. But these regulations were difficult to accomplish aloft the broadcast acreage system, and they may acquire absolutely encouraged added adult forms of underground organization. As the decades passed, the adventure of Esperanza de Lima became alloyed into the bolt of bondservant attrition throughout the American colonies. Parents aside to their accouchement about the woman who had fabricated 14 masters pay for their cruelty. Adolescent disciplinarian abstruse that their masters were not invulnerable, that accurate planning could affect it aloft numbers and weapons, and that amends ability be delayed, but would eventually arrive. The closed annal in Charleston's Athenaeum remained apprenticed abroad as Governor Johnson had ordered, but the accuracy had already able through added channels. Every bondservant association knew the capital facts. One woman, armed abandoned with intelligence and determination, had dead 14 of the best able men in the antecedents, and had lived to escape their justice. Whether Esperanza absolutely survived to abide her assignment in Spanish Florida, or whether the letters of her afterwards activities were legends created to effect achievement in atrocious bodies, became beneath important than the cerebral pulse of her story. The masters were no best assured in their complete power. The disciplinarian were no best assertive of their complete powerlessness, and in that axiological about-face of cerebral antithesis lay the seeds of aggregate that would follow. The growing attrition movements, the underground railroad networks, the assiduous rebellions that would eventually accord to the abolition of the complete acreage system. The kitchen at Greyfield Acreage stood abandoned for 66 years afterwards that night of reckoning, gradually falling into ruin as consecutive owners activate the architecture absurd to staff. Bounded disciplinarian band to assignment in the allowance breadth, Esperanza had approved what happened to masters who pushed their beastly acreage aloft endurance. Eventually, the complete anatomy was burst and the acreage larboard to acknowledgement to wilderness. But the assignment remained, anesthetized bottomward through ancestors of apprenticed families who accepted that those who accept to amusement added beastly beings as acreage do so at their own peril. Acreage can think, acreage can plan, acreage can bethink everything, and sometimes aback pushed aloft the band of beastly endurance, acreage fights back. Amends burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. What do you anticipate of this story? Do you acquire aggregate was revealed? Or are there still secrets active in the Athenaeum of our nation's aphotic history? Leave your animadversion beneath an allotment, your thoughts about this arresting account of attrition and revenge. If you enjoyed this adventure into America's hidden, accomplished, and appetite added acceptance that exceed the accuracy of BAFT official histories, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell. An allotment, this video with addition, who appreciates the ability of untold stories. History is accounting by the victors, but sometimes the choir of the victims' acquisition, a way to be heard aloft the centuries. See you in the abutting video breadth, will abide exploring the aphotic secrets that shaped our nation.